Thank you, everybody, again. And sorry about the false start. Thank you for your kind introduction, Sam, as well. I'm going to be just the first speaker today, and it's actually not going to be quite exactly as advertised because Pat and Christy are not going to be able to be here in person, but David is going to join me for their section of the talk. So I'm going to be talking to you about living weight today. There are a whole variety of different ways of celebrating when somebody passes. A non-living weight, i.e. a funeral, is, I'm sure, something that many of you have attended for other people before. It's a huge amount of work to organise. It can be very expensive, and it can actually be quite a burden for survivors, especially if somebody's died suddenly without any planning and nobody really knowing what that person might have wanted. There can also be conflict that can occur because of disagreement amongst family members. So just at the time when everybody should be coming together, the stress of actually having to put on a funeral can be really quite distressing. And the worst thing about it is if you're the person that is going to be honoured at the funerals, you don't get to be there. So you miss out on all the stress, but you also miss out on all the fun if it's going to be a really great event. So I'm going to just briefly talk a little bit about funerals, and then we're going to go on to talk about the living weight. Just before I go on, is this okay for volume for everyone? Yeah, okay. So if you are planning a funeral, try to make sure that your loved ones know what was important to you. People can do all sorts of different things, but for example, if you might not want your funeral to be held at a church if you were not religious. You might not want it to be held at the golf club if you actually hated golf. You might not want to have it held at a garden centre if you really hated gardening. Choosing a good photo for an obituary is really important. My dad sent me one about 2 years ago, and I said, "Oh, this is a really nice picture, Dad. What's that for?" He's perfectly healthy, mid-70s, and he said, "Oh, that's my photo for the paper when I die." And I thought, you know what, that's a really good idea. Good planning, Dad. Designating a charity is also very important, so that a lot of people, when they die, they don't want to have money spent on flowers. They just see that as a waste. Though flowers are nice, money is often better, especially when it's directed at specific charities. Knowing whether somebody wants to be buried or cremated or one of the other varieties of end-of-life body management can be really important to know. Whether you want to have speakers or hymns or whatever at the funeral, also really important. A story I'll tell you as well is my father-in-law died about 5 years ago in England. And if anyone here is from England remembers Morecambe and Wise, the TV show, as his coffin went into the crematorium area, it was Bring Me Sunshine, which was the theme tune from Morecambe and Wise, which was absolutely hilarious. And just at a time when everybody would be normally sort of feeling sad, the whole place just broke out in laughter, and that was exactly what my father-in-law would have wanted. Deciding what to do about ashes, like scattering of ashes, whether you want a gravestone, whether you want a memorial bench or a plaque in the crematorium garden. All these things are really important to think about beforehand. You don't want to be waiting until somebody's died and then trying to figure out what they might have wanted. And when you've actually done a lot of this planning, people feel a huge weight off their minds. And if you plan your funeral, you can always change your mind and do something different. But I think it's really quite a reassuring thing for people to know that once they've actually done this, they can relax and just look forward to living as well as they can up until that point. Survivors can be comfortable that they did the right thing, and families can be drawn together at a time of stress instead of having this potential for argument. There's a lot of study also looking at dysfunctional grief, and if somebody's had a good send-off, that does seem to mark the occasion quite well, and it helps families and loved ones to get over that. So there's a whole variety of things you can do about coffins. Hopefully you can see some of these pictures. I particularly like the Marlborough one. My dad said he wanted a tin of St. Bruno, but I don't know if you can actually get that anymore, certainly not at that life size. Moving on from funerals, I wanted to sort of hit that right off the ground so that you know that we are here to talk about how to die well, but most importantly, how to live well until you get to that point. And now, hopefully, the rest of this whole day is going to be much more about how to live, and not talking about dying. But I wanted to just get that on the table so we can get over it right at the beginning. So the alternative to a funeral is to have a living wake, and these are the ideas of what a living wake would be about. So it's an opportunity really to say goodbye to your friends and family, and to say thank you for all the many wonderful things that people do for each other during life. An opportunity also to hear thank yous, surprisingly sometimes from people that you didn't realize you'd had such an impact on, and to reminisce a little bit and remember the good times. And you can have more than one. That's also an important thing to know. And we're going to talk a little bit about timing. One thing I didn't think about a little bit until recently was for people who have dementia, having a living wake is actually this idea about remembering the good times can be a really important thing, because though as we go further into Alzheimer's disease, we tend to remember the old times but not the recent times. Knowing that your memory might be affected in the future, it doesn't mean that that you don't have have good memories that you want to celebrate before your cognitive function declines. So even if you're not expected to die soon, if you expect to lose your cognitive functioning to an extent, that's another time to have a living wake, even if you're not expecting to die very quickly. So this is one of the first annual Living Wakes. This is actually a gentleman who attended our very first Bucket List Festival, and had he advertised in the newspaper so he could make sure everybody that knew him would be able to come, and he called it the first annual Living Wake. Another example is a patient of mine, Derek Miller, who before he died gave me permission to use his story for education and public talks. And these are some quotes from his blog. He was a young man who had, he was a musician, and he had a blog which was actually followed by thousands of people all over the world. He had a very strong following, and when he died, he had a posthumous post put up, and it, quote, went viral, and millions of people read his blog all around the world. So Derek had a real legacy. He was a wonderful young man. And his living wake was one of the big things for him in his last few months of life. So I'm not going to read it to you. You can all read, but it goes through, and I've got a series of slides here with quotes from him for what he did with his wife. So they had the living wake in the Waldorf Hotel, you know, the tiki-themed room in the old Waldorf Hotel. It's sort of an iconic Vancouver venue. They had a couple of hundred people. They had a Lebanese buffet. He's not Lebanese. I don't know why. He just really liked Lebanese food. So he said, that's what I want, and that's what I'm going to have. He had a lot of music people there. Some of you may know the group The Odds. They were from the sort of 70s and 80s, quite a well-known Vancouver band. They had fire regulations that they had to work around, so getting the numbers right was a little bit stressful, but they managed it. They had this huge party, basically, and it went on till really late at night. They had to have some degree of flexibility with the numbers. They had a few people show up that they didn't expect, and they had a few people that they had hoped to be able to come, weren't able to, but they had ways of kind of getting around that. They said they had a few people that they wish they could have invited if they'd had contact information, so that's something else to be aware of. Don't ever lose your old address books. Keep your old email accounts. Make sure that you keep track of everybody, because these days being able to communicate electronically via email is probably the most efficient way of contacting people. Not rushing it, making sure that there's plenty of time during the event so that you get a chance to see everybody. The time really goes fast. I mean, I remember at my wedding we had 110 people, which is not a huge wedding, but at the end of the day, and I mean, the wedding went on like for hours. We started at like 10 o'clock in the morning. We didn't finish till 2 o'clock in the morning. And I still felt at the end of the day that I hadn't had chance to talk to everybody. So at a living wake, it's going to be very much the same thing. Everyone will want a little piece of you to be able to talk, and you'll need time to rest as well. So make sure that you don't plan it to be just for an hour or two. Make sure you give yourself a good long time. being able to participate is really important. You have to do something that's you're comfortable with, and you have to plan your rests. We actually had a sort of practice run with Derek, and I adjusted his medications, and he actually adjusted his sleep-wake cycle for the week prior to the event, so that he could actually be sure that he could stay up and be alert and awake right up until the 1 o'clock in the morning. We actually tested him with a low dose of a stimulant, a drug called Ritalin. We tested it a few days before just to make sure that we knew exactly what dose he needed and how well he tolerated and how much benefit he would get from it. We optimized his pain management to be just perfect, and we got everything as good as we could. He rested the days before, he had a nap, and then that way he knew that when the event happened, he was absolutely ready. Having a room upstairs in the hotel was really helpful, because when everybody was eating, that was his time to go and have a rest. He didn't really eat anymore, so he didn't particularly want to watch people eating either. So this was his opportunity to go and lie down. He was exhausted afterwards, but he said this was really worth it. I paid for it all the next day, but it was entirely worth it. Saying thank you to everybody that can come is really important. Then he did it via his blog, but there are a variety of other ways of doing it, sending out thank you cards, sending out emails, that sort of thing. And then I'm going to just let David talk about another living wake, which was from Pat McConkey and his wife, Christy. So David was actually present at that living wake, and he's going to tell us a little bit about that now.
Hello? Oh, yes, here we are. I've never had such a big voice. So, my very good friend, Pat McConkey, unfortunately, was found to have a brain tumor, and was not a very nice brain tumor. And but he responded well to surgery, chemo, and radiation. That was 4 years ago. The tumor that he unfortunately had, it was one that normally doesn't have a long period of life following the diagnosis, but he has done amazingly well. So Pat and Christy, his wife, was a nurse, and they live in Crescent Beach. They're not here today because somehow or another we got our dates crossed. She thought it was the 30th. In any event, I attended his wake, and it was really great. It was out at the University Golf Club, and 200 people were invited. And see, these are some of her slides that she sent. Pat is there in the middle, and you can see that he has wonderful friends around him, and he's having a great time. There was a real good mixing, and people who hadn't seen each other for a long, long time, not only did they get a chance to reconnect, but had a wonderful connection with Pat and Christy. All generations were involved, and these three characters managed to distract all of the speakers, but were totally welcome and added good levity to the event. I must say there was a lot of laughter and a lot of fun. This is Pat's daughter with her daughter, and she was the MC. Here's Christy with her wonderful sense of humor. They had special gifts for everybody. Inside each of these boxes was a little silver flask, which would hold a good 3 good ounces of scotch. And so there wasn't scotch in them, but there was some way to remember the wake and remember Pat. I got into trouble, of course. So we had several different speakers that talked about Pat from his medical career. He is still a very, no longer practicing, but was a very accomplished orthopedic surgeon, particularly with knee reconstructions, and probably operated on most of the crazy Canucks and the Canadian ski team. Here they are helping us. Other speakers were present who roasted and toasted Pat, and you can see that this is all orthopedic surgeons around him that fondly remember him and all the things he got up to and the hijinks he got up to. So overall, it was a very successful day. And it was his first annual. And he is ready for a second annual Living Wake. And we're going to do something this year, only instead of the McConkeys coughing up for the party, all his friends will.
Thanks, David. So that's a really good example of somebody close to home who's done this fairly recently. Can I ask, is there anybody here who's been to a Living Wake? A couple. Would you be willing to just say a couple of words about it? Maybe you first and the gentleman at the back.
It was a wonderful opportunity for all of us to be together and to celebrate her and for her to hear it from all of us. It was a lot of laughter and a lot of joy, and she shared that with us. It was a very positive, uplifting experience and a good way to say goodbye.
And where was it?
It was held in a Chinese restaurant.
Chinese restaurant. Okay.
She gave out, she's a martini drinker, so we all had
Martini. Seems like there's an alcoholic theme to these. Maybe it's the party types are the ones that really go for this. And the gentleman at the back.
I attended one of the person who had been very much involved in the community. So it was held at a local community center, and it was luckily there was enough time, and it was there was enough opportunity to invite the person's all their friends, and the person was because of their medical condition was able and had there was no need to have extensive modification of medicines
Accommodation,
and other
yeah.
things. So it was an interesting, and it was several years ago, so it was a novel event, and people hadn't really thought about it. But for all the reasons that you're speaking to, it was that opportunity to hear those thanks, to people to come forward and express the impact that person had made upon their life. You know, those things that person probably didn't have any idea was, and it offered that last several weeks. The second one I went to was a day before someone passed, and I must say, very awkward, or somewhat awkward, in that there was a sign on the front door, and this was out in Richmond. It was a person in a running group, so people had known this person for 25 years through the Y Marathon Clinic, and the comment was, assume that, and I forget the person's name, assume that the person is understanding what you say. So carry out a conversation. So they actually recorded these. As you came in, you greeted this person who was, at that point, unfortunately, and they, as the person said, I wish we had done it a week earlier. The person was somewhat comatose. But it was interesting. And I expressed the funny gesture. This was a group of, a walking group. So there were lots of women in the walking group. I was a member of the walking group at the beginning. And I commented that to the person who was the race leader, I said, unfortunately, I learned an awful lot about sports bras, or a lot more about sports bras than I really needed to know. And whether it was the person actually smiled, or there was a sense of smile, and they got this on film of this firm, and up until this point, everyone just assumed that the person was beyond acknowledging the comment. But there was this, and it brought life to the wake, or to the event, the Living Wake, because then everyone realized that in fact there was, and whether the person was going in and out of consciousness, it brought new vitality to the event. And it was a little bit difficult to attend in the first place, but I'm sure glad I did.
Okay, thank you. That's really a wonderful story to share. I guess one of the take-home messages for that is don't wait. Like if you put it off, then you might miss it, and then it changes from being a living wake to being an actual funeral. So if you think this might be something that's right for you, don't put it off. I have had people. Sorry, there's a lot of feedback here. I don't know why. I've had people say, "Well, what happens if I do one and then I bump into one of my guests in Safeways the next week? What am I going to say? Like, should I duck behind the butter or something? Because they won't know what to say." And I say, no, you say, hi, thanks so much for coming. We had such a great time, didn't we? And you can reminisce about the party. So there's, I think it's really important that people don't put these things off, just like not putting off talking about it, like talking about what our advanced care planning or our advanced directives might be. If you wait until you're really sick to have these conversations, then they're going to be much more difficult and much less likely to come to a satisfactory conclusion for you to then be, oh, I've dealt with that, and then move on. So just a few pointers, and I did give David a brief summary of this part, just so that you have something that you can take home if you are thinking about doing this. First is making sure that you pick a place where you're comfortable, as I mentioned. It could be a Chinese restaurant, it could be the golf club, could be the sailing club, could be just your house if you happen to be fortunate enough to have a big enough house. Pick a time which works for you. And if you know you're not an evening person and you're just about done by 7 o'clock every night, then have a lunch or have a breakfast. A lot of people prefer breakfast. That's their favorite meal of the day. Do something that works for you. Do what you find fun. Have a practice run, as I mentioned with Derek. Have a practice run so that you know that everything's going to go nice and smooth, even including checking out the sound system. And don't be cheap. It actually costs a lot to have a funeral. And if you're not going to have a funeral as well, think of all that money that you would be spending or your estate would be spending on the funeral and spend that on the party. And that includes giving everybody a little silver flask. If that's what you want, it's going to cost you a lot of money. But if that's what's meaningful to you, you can't take it with you. So spend it on things that you want. It's very difficult to organize any big event such as this, but even more when you've got music and a whole lot of other things going on. So have a group of people to help you organize. If you're trying to do it with just a small group, it can be quite a lot of work. So share the work, give everybody one job and have them do it really well. Organize it. You need someone to coordinate to make sure that everyone's communicating properly, but try to share the load. Optimize the medications that I mentioned beforehand, planning time for rest, and having a rest day following. Don't do it the day before you leave on a cruise. You have to be up early to go to a doctor's appointment, or you've got a CT scan booked or something like that, or you've got all your grandchildren coming to visit the next day. One thing that's very important that I've heard from a number of people that have had living wakes is get somebody official to take photographs or video, because you won't be able to remember everything, and you'll think, oh gosh, yeah, Auntie Susie, I thought she was there, but I didn't get a chance to say hello. So even have a photo booth, or have a professional photographer going around taking pictures or recording little videos from people, because that way you can look at them after the event and kind of relive it in more detail. So it sort of prolongs the fun. Timing can be a challenge, and I think we've covered how important it is not to leave it too late. And remember that some people don't like being the center of attention. They don't want to feel like they're being spoiled. But this is not just about your enjoyment. It's also about a gift to your loved ones, because it'll help them to feel good about being able to show how much they care for you and how much they love you. And that really is a gift. Sometimes we are not very good at taking compliments and receiving congratulations, receiving presents, but it is actually a gift to be able to allow people to do this. And lastly, just have as much fun as you can. Hopefully, some of you will consider it if and when the time comes. I know I will, and I hope that you have a wonderful time. So we have a bit more time for questions if anyone has any more. I was actually not bad in terms of timing. Okay, we're good. Thank you.